Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. The subject of my talk is fossil fuels and prosperity. Let's start with some basic energy realities. Fossil fuels drive economic growth and jobs. There have been numerous studies over the past several decades documenting this. Fossil fuels currently provide well over 80% of world energy, and all objective, reasonable forecasts indicate they will continue to for at least the next 30 or 40 years, as far as forecasts can go. Renewable energy currently provides a small portion of world energy and will continue to do so at best. Proposals to drastically reduce fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions, such as the Paris Climate Accord, which I'll talk about more, would devastate the world economies and the U.S. economies. As we know, the Paris Agreement wants to limit global temperature increases by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and thus fossil fuel production and consumption to 80 to 95% below, not current levels, not forecast levels, but levels they were in 1990. And that is critical to keep in mind, as I'll mention in a minute. As we'll see, the reductions are ludicrous. They're laughable. They're impossible. What has fossil fuels done for us recently or lately? They're the foundation of our current economy. They created the modern world. They sustain the modern world. They permit the current high quality of life we all enjoy. Over the past 2 centuries, life expectancy has more than doubled. Population has increased 8-fold. Real incomes have increased worldwide more than 11-fold. At the same time, due to the utilization of fossil fuels, CO2 emissions have also increased. As Dr. Smil, one of the world's foremost energy experts, has noted, ours is a high-energy civilization based largely on fossil fuels. This graph, just shows what I just told you. There's a high correlation and relationship between every modern metric of a decent life and the consumption of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. As Bob Ayers has noted, the economic system is essentially a system for extracting, processing, and transforming energy. Thus, there's a close link between CO2 emissions and GDP, as I've graphed it here through 2010. According to the World Bank, access to energy is absolutely fundamental in the struggle against poverty, as we've heard from the previous 2 speakers. Let's talk about forecasts. Global GDP is forecast to increase about 3-fold by 2050. In 2050, according to any reasonable objective forecast, be it IEA, EIA, BP, Exxon, World Economic Council, fossil fuels in the year 2050 will still provide well over 80% of the world's energy. And these forecasts, and this is a very important point to keep in mind, these forecasts all assume a delinking of the relationship between carbon and GDP. They assume, in the forecast they're making, massive increases in energy efficiency and massive increases, at least in absolute terms, in the use of renewable energies. Thus, there is still, for the foreseeable future, again, any forecast made, a close link, as far as we can determine into the future, between GDP and fossil fuels and thus CO2 emissions. Again, in the year 2050, fossil fuels will continue to provide well over 80% of the world's energy, according to every reasonable objective forecast that's out there. And again, renewable energy will be able to supply only a very small portion of the world's energy, as far as anyone can determine. We've just heard the previous 2 speakers why that is, especially from Paul Dreesen's. Here's the bottom line. Fossil fuels drive the economy and jobs. They currently power over 80% of the world economies, and they will continue to power over 80% of the world's economies. Thus, fossil fuels will continue to be essential to the U.S. world economies and jobs. As the World Economic Forum has noted, energy is the oxygen of the economy and the lifeblood of growth, and fossil fuels are essential to the world's energy supply. If you take away only one thing from my presentation this morning, remember this. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Paris Agreement says that we must reduce CO2 emissions and therefore fossil fuel utilization up to 95%, not below current emissions, not below forecast emissions, where world GDP is going to increase threefold, but below emissions where they were in 1990. That's a 96% reduction in forecast fossil fuel utilization in the year 2050. A 96% reduction of what fossil fuel utilization is forecast to be in the year 2050. The goal is 10% of 1990 emissions. In the words of Mr. Microsoft himself, Bill Gates, if you could pick just one thing to reduce poverty, by far you would pick energy. So what does a 90 or 95% reduction in fossil fuel utilization mean for the world or for the U.S.? Economic catastrophe, economic disaster. For the U.S., instead, in the year 2050, instead of median household incomes in the range of over $90,000 a year in constant dollars, 2013 dollars, the average median family income would be about $300 a month. Think about that for a minute. If you had to live today on $300 a month, that's what it implies. That's about 1/4 or 1/5 the current poverty level. That's way less than you make even working at the minimum wage at the present time. You know, it is so ludicrous. It's so ridiculous. It's laughable. But that's what the Paris bureaucrats are talking about. That's what it means. Let's say I've exaggerated the effects. Let's say I'm off by 50%. Well, great. Then we'd have almost $400 a month to live on. $450 a month to live on. That's what we're talking about. So, again, if you remember one thing from my talk this morning, remember that. All right, in conclusion, fossil fuels are essential for the economy, for the economic growth and jobs. There is a close relationship between fossil fuels and world economies, and this relationship will continue in the future as far as anyone can see, according to any legitimate forecast. To reduce 2050 greenhouse gas emissions to 80 to 95% below actual 1990 levels implies world 2050 living standards would be reduced to something that people enjoyed in the 1880s, I'm sorry. So if you think life was great in 1870, it's wonderful. No internal combustion engines, no airline travel, no electricity, no refrigeration, no air conditioning, no iPhones, no internet, no computers. That's what we're talking about. That's what they're talking about. That's how ridiculous and ludicrous it is. All the economic gains of the Industrial Revolution and later would be nullified. Average world per capita GDP would be reduced to levels currently well below those of the most impoverished nations today, well below those of Bangladesh, Haiti, North Korea, Yemen, etc. These are the real implications of the Paris Accords of reducing fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emissions to 95% below the 1990 levels within about 30 years. They're draconian, infeasible, and impossible. They're truly ludicrous. And in conclusion, this cannot be allowed to happen, and we among others, should prevent this. Thank you.